to History Inside a Nutshell, the show where we sail into our port of call discussing maritime history. And in today's video, this is going to be something different because it is the anniversary since the sinking of the Titanic's sister ship, the HMS Britannic. But I know I said it's going to be different, but it's not going to be so different because I have invited my friend Jake to come back as well.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello again.
If you are new to the channel before, Jake has been known to actually do a few videos, like interviews of different historical figures, but there is one thing that Jake is very famous for, and it is for a nickname that he has. And Jake, what nickname is that?
I have been often called Mr. Britannic. I don't know. I don't know why, but Mr. Britannic. I think it's I've accumulated a lot of knowledge on the Britannic, and there's always something new to learn. But a lot of people have called me Mr. Britannic because I'm known more for that. So.
But it's so great to see you again then, Jake, because especially since I know that we've done videos of Arthur John Priest and Violet Jessup, and if you haven't seen them on YouTube or haven't listened to them on Spotify yet, I will leave links, and if you want to check them out or have a watch or a listen, please feel free to do so. But I know that in Violet Jessup's video that we did, you've mentioned like a really lot of good detail on the Britannic, but I know that knowing you, Jake, you've got fascinating information to talk about of the Britannic, and you do learn something new every day, really. So I thought that for today's interview, you're going to be the star of the show. So I'm going to let you take the lead from one way to the other, because not only you are going to talk about the history, but you're going to be talking about something that's describes like a very big amount of detail of the sinking based on an eyewitness account from a survivor. But we'll definitely let you get onto that once we go through the interview anyway.
Yeah.
So Jake, all yours, take it away.
Yeah, so the Britannic was one of three ships. She was the third and final of the Olympic class ships. I know I've covered a lot of this in the Violet Jessup and the Arthur John Priest interview, but just to go over it again for those people that may have missed it, or I only covered. There's lots to do with Britannic that I may have not covered. So the Britannic was finally a keel was finally laid down on the 30th of November 1911. Again, like I said in the last interviews, the White Star Line, although they had planned for three ships, in fact, they reconstructed their shipyard to fit these ocean liners in. Although they had designed the Britannic very early on, they were not committed on making a third and final ship. It was only that they wanted to see how the Olympic would handle, how popular she would become, that J. Bruce Ismay, who was sailing on the Olympic, was so excited and enthusiastic of how well Olympic had done, that he then ordered the third and final of the Olympic class, which would be yard number 433. She hadn't got her name straight away. Even the Titanic and the Olympic were not given their names straight away. They were known by ship numbers or shipyard numbers, which Titanic was 401, Olympic was 400, and the Britannic would be 433. So it was in around June 1911, the Britannic was given her name. As I've said before, the Britannic, there'd been a lot of rumors around the time that the third and final ship would be called Gigantic, but that is not the case. There is only very few evidence to suggest that Britannic would be Gigantic, but they're more external documents to do with the anchor. Hingley's had been given or had been sent a letter for the order of the anchor for the Britannic, which had the name Gigantic written in the letter. as for the name of the third ship. And also there was an order book that had from Hingley's that also had gigantic crossed out and replaced with the Britannic. But Harland and Wolff documents and White Star documents, internal documents, all point to Britannic, the name Britannic. A lot of people thought that her name was changed to Britannic after the sinking of the Titanic, but that's not the case. She was given her name way before Titanic even left Belfast. When the Titanic sank, they had to change some stuff on Britannic because of safety, because Britannic she was designed practically the same as the Titanic originally, but because of the Titanic sinking, they had to change most of the stuff that would have what was on Titanic from chips, but we were going to change it on Britannic. Lucky enough, as I've said before, that the Britannic was very early on in the construction, very early on. Her keel had only been laid in November 1911. Titanic sank in April 1912. I don't think even the skeleton was, it was just taking form. So they hadn't even plated her yet. So, which was lucky, because they could go back to the drawing board, and they had to stop all work on Britannic until they had found the findings from the British Board of Trade the inquiry into the sinking. So what they found was that Britannic needed double hulling. So she had a double hull stretched from bow up to the engine room. And what that would do was to, if the ship ran aground or if she struck an iceberg, just like the Titanic, that the double skin would protect the bulkheads, the inner side of the ship, to stop the ship from flooding, I suppose. The other thing that needed to be done was at least 5 of her watertight bulkheads went up as far as B deck, which was the bridge deck. What they found on Titanic was the bulkheads did not go high enough. They only went as high as E deck. As the Titanic was sinking, as she sank lower and lower and lower, the bulkheads would flood and they would flow over the top because there was nothing to stop that. So on Britannic, they sealed that off and they were able to raise those bulkheads higher. Also, Britannic was able to stay afloat with 6 compartments completely flooded, as long as she was stationary. If she was stationary, it should be completely fine. They extended the ship from 15 watertight bulkheads to 16. So she had an extra bulkhead in the electric engine room, which would again protect the ship from any flooding. So the bulkheads would be able to contain the flooding if there was any. The other thing that needed to be done was the welling davits on the Titanic. Now, what they found with Titanic is that it took so long to launch the lifeboats. They had to float 2 of them off. Even within the 2 hours and 40 minutes, 2 of the collapsibles that had been stacked up onto the officers' quarters on the Titanic, they found it very difficult to get them off that rooftop. So it just took such an immense amount of time to launch these lifeboats. So they needed an efficient way of abandoning ship and getting passengers off safely and very swiftly. So what they decided was to fit these big, massive gantry davits. They look like big crane things, which would be run by electricity. There would be a power box on the boat deck that they could be powered by, and they could be controlled. And what these gantry davits would do was they were able to, if there was a list to the ship, they would still be able to launch the lifeboats. It wouldn't affect, because what happens with ships, especially if you look at Lusitania, the list of the ship, on one side of the ship, the port lifeboats became totally useless because of the list to starboard. That's half the lifeboats on board the ship completely useless. They can't launch. So, you know, they needed an efficient way for the davits to be able to still function, even if there is a list to the ship. And that's what these gantry davits were designed to do. They were also designed to launch a lifeboat from the other side of the ship, so they were able to reach over and launch a lifeboat. So if a lifeboat needs to be launched on the starboard side, the port davits would be able to get over to starboard and launch a starboard lifeboat. Still very, very economic. But the problem is they never really took off in the shipping business, because it was so big and so huge and very complicated things to fit on, especially a commercial ship such as the Britannic. And only a few ships in history ever had them. They were on a smaller scale. But also what they had to do with Britannic was they had to stiffen her in certain places, and also strengthen her in 8 different places, because she was supposed to have 8 of these gantry davits on the vessel. So the Britannic was launched. In fact, the shipbuilding, you know, the shipbuilder magazine in Belfast, one of the reporters said, let's hope they've got it right this time. That this ship is so magnificent, but let's hope they've got it right this time. And this is before even Britannic hit the sea, you know, before she even floated. So they were hoping they had got it right this time. Then I suppose Britannic was always going to be, and same with the Olympic, they were always going to be surrounded with this shadow of the Titanic, because obviously they were sisters to the Titanic. There was a massive you know, mutiny from the crew on the Olympic. As soon as the Titanic had gone down, they were arrested and, you know, thrown in prison for it. They were released without charge later, but, you know, they were thrown in prison. And I suppose that again with the Britannic, they were both shadowed in the Titanic disaster, because I mean, even the shipbuilder magazine said, let's hope they've got it right this time. Britannic was launched on the 26th of February. It took 3 years to build. So she was launched on the 26th of February 1914. And it took 81 seconds for the Britannic to float for the first time. Obviously, they were converting her into passenger ship at this time. And but unfortunately, what happened was with the Britannic, the war, the world was at war by August 1914. So unfortunately, work had to be halted on Britannic, and she was practically still painted in the same colour from the day she was launched for quite a long time, for 6 months before any commercial paint or any, you know, hospital paint was ever put on her. She was painted grey. She stayed like that for months. The Holland and Wolff needed to divert their attention into the war, and, you know, building battleships and so forth. What happened with the war is casualties were rising, especially in the Aegean, the Mediterranean. Casualties were rising, and this was before aviation came in. So the only way they could get these soldiers back to England was by ocean. So they were going to dip into the commercial business and take commercial ships, and they were going to hire them out or use them. So Holland and Wolff came up with an agreement with the British Admiralty to use Britannic as a hospital ship, because she was a big ship, 882 foot long, with more than 3,000 wounded soldiers could be fitted on her. Rooms could be converted into theatres, and, you know, promenades could be converted into wards, and that's what was done on Britannic. The Admiralty had come up with an agreement that they would pay to complete Britannic. They would finish her off. They would complete the construction and the fitting out, as long as they could use her as a hospital ship. So they came with an agreement, but also they came with an agreement that they would pay White Star Line £75,000 if they could use her. Now, unfortunately, because of how quick Britannic was put into hospital service, only 5 of the original 8 gantry davits were ever fitted to the ship. But to make up the loss of these gantry davits, these 3 extra gantry davits, was they would fit 6 welling davits on each side of the ship, and 2 on the stern. And that would make up 55 lifeboats altogether, which is fantastic, which is more than what was on Titanic. Because although it took a while for the Titanic to launch a lifeboat, she still managed to launch the amount of lifeboats she did within 2 and 4, just apart from the 2 that didn't get off completely by the davits. They had to be floated. They worked. They did work, and they were efficient for the time. So, why fix something when it ain't broken to a certain extent? To put these on Britannic to make up that loss for the 3 gantry davits. Some of the passenger facilities were rooms and that were converted into theatres and wards and so forth, and also quarters for the nursing staff and the doctor staff. And then she entered hospital service on the 23rd of December 1915.
Oh, so that's 2 days before Christmas Day.
Yeah, her maiden voyage was on the 23rd of December 1915, and under the command of Captain Bartlett, Captain Charles Alfred Bartlett, who was appointed the superintendent of the White Star Line in January 1912. And he knew the Titanic very well, and he knew the crew. In fact, Captain Bartlett had sailed with Mr. Murdoch, First Officer Murdoch. He knew Officer Murdoch. He'd sailed with him in the past. I believe he sailed with Mr. Murdoch, Officer Murdoch, on the Gothic, which had been on fire while Captain Bartlett was in command of it. Yeah, so Captain Bartlett, he was a very, very intelligent and very liked and popular captain. The crew absolutely loved him. He was just a nice man, but but people knew where they stood with him. Once he was captain, they knew, that he was the captain. He was a bit like Captain Smith. If you walked in the room, you'd know, because he had that presence about him. But they still loved him. Captain Bartlett had been given the nickname by his crew who had sailed with him in the past, Iceberg Charlie. And he, from what was recollected, is that he had the ability to smell ice or ice fields from miles away. So his safety record, and I think that's why he was so popular, because his safety record was spotless. For him to put in the command of Britannic, because he was a Royal Navy Reserve officer anyway, so he would have been probably one of the first choices for Britannic. I mean, he had this relationship with Britannic. He loved Britannic. He'd seen it from construction. He had seen over her construction, so he had this an affinity relationship with Britannic. He did have an affection for that ship in particular. So on the 23rd of December 1915, she went out, and she had sailed from Liverpool. That was her designated dock where she sailed from on her maiden voyage. But on Britannic, there seemed to have been a problem on Britannic. I don't know whether that was on a maiden voyage or during one of the voyages. A Dr. Goodman, who had been in charge of a few wards in the forward end of the ship, had found that the Britannic was leaking. Some of his wards had been flooded. It turned out one of the portholes had been leaking, so it'd been bringing on water. And also there had been a broken valve in the water pump or in the water tank that had also been damaged and also flooding his wards. So you can imagine he wasn't best pleased. So
it must have been really scary.
Definitely, especially when you're on a ship and it's connected to the Titanic. You're gonna think, oh dear. So his ward had to be drained out and repaired. So that was, people would say, a lot of people would say that might have been an omen for Britannic for what was to come for her. in particular. And Britannic was she was a very successful ship. She had many voyages backwards and forth to the Dardanelles campaign, which was in the Mediterranean, bringing back wounded soldiers. And she must have brought back more than 10,000 wounded soldiers during her time. But on one of her voyages in January 1916, a man came onto the bridge and said someone had jumped overboard. Unfortunately, even with Britannic's protective status, they could not stop the ship. In peacetime, they would have stopped the ship and searched the ocean. Unfortunately, in wartime, they couldn't do that, even for a hospital ship, because Captain Bartlett would be classified as putting those, the souls on board in danger. So Britannic could have been torpedoed or whatever. Should have been sitting duck if a rogue U-boat decided to fire upon a hospital ship, a civilian hospital ship, and sink the ship. So he couldn't stop the ship. So what they had to do was they had to go through who was on board, and they found that it was a Samuel Jones from the Royal Battalion Regiment, who had committed suicide, had jumped overboard, and his body was never found. He was presumed dead and lost at sea, and his body was never recovered. But again, this was commonplace. It's not the first time, and it wouldn't be the last time. I'm sure it happened on other ships too, but I think Britannic. It's all recorded in the ship's log and everything. So that was a sad moment. And then she was handed back to the White Star Line around June 1916 because, casualties were dropping and they couldn't really come up with a reason why they would keep Britannic in hospital service. So they handed her back. But unfortunately, again, as agreed, the White Star Line were paid £75,000 for the Britannic, for the use of Britannic, as agreed. But during that time of her being handed back, they were converting her into passenger ship service. But around August 1916, she was handed back to the Admiralty because the casualties were rising, particularly in the Dardanelles campaign and the Aegean Ocean, the Mediterranean, in Greece. So she was back in service, and again, she wasn't supposed to go out on the time she went out on a fateful voyage, the one that she would never return home. It was actually supposed to be the Aquitania. The Aquitania was supposed to go out, but she was damaged in a storm, so Britannic had to go out. And Britannic had only just come back from her 5th voyage out. So she wasn't due to go out, but she ended up going out anyway. So she had to go out 2 weeks earlier than she was supposed to. Britannic left Southampton on the 12th of November, around 2:10, 2:30 in the afternoon. Around November 17th, 1916, she arrived in Naples to do a coal refueling. But during that time of her being there, a storm had taken place. Unfortunately, Captain Bartlett was in command of a ship that didn't belong to him. It was company property, so he was a bit afraid of getting out of the narrow docks of harbour of Naples in a storm that size, especially for a size of the Britannic was. So they waited for a couple of days, and they finally left on the 19th of November. So as soon as they left, the seas were rough again. And one of the ladies on board, Sheila Macbeth, she said it was just dreadful. Her cabin was on the lower decks, and she had to go down these narrow stairwells, and in a storm it was just dreadful, because you was just wobbling from one place to another. Although Britannic was built with 4 expansion joints, which was 2 more than what was on Titanic. The expansion joints, for those who are unaware what they are, is they're like gaps, I suppose, in the decks of the ship that if a ship went over a wave, they would bend. So instead of them feeling, making life uncomfortable on a ship, they would bend. So you didn't really feel the strain, and also it would take most of the strain for the ship as well, because these were large ships, so they were expected to experience a lot of stresses. To take most of that stress was that Britannic was fitted with, and not just Britannic, but also Titanic and Olympic were fitted with expansion joints, which would make life a little bit easier on board ship for those if they were in rough seas, and also make the ships more integrity, their structure to be more the integrity of the ship itself, the structure. Anyway, so she said it was just dreadful because the Britannic was just rolling all over the place, and you can understand why most people on the ship probably got sick. At 8:12 a.m. on the 21st of November, everybody was sitting down for breakfast. People like Violet Jessop and Sheila Macbeth Mitchell, they were all sitting down for breakfast. Then suddenly there was this explosion, and the ship seemed to lift a little, and everything through the ship either crashed to the floor or broke. It was just horrible. And so everyone rose up out of the seats. Violet Jessop, she was in the pantry at the time. She was taking care of this nurse who had been sick, and she was completely useless, as Violet would say. And she was helping her get dressed and everything, and making sure that if there was to get into a lifeboat, that she could get down with dignity, the nurse. So she put her nurse's clothes on over her pajamas, so if she was to climb down a ladder into a lifeboat, that she could get down with dignity. Sheila mentions this big bang. Sheila Macbeth Mitchell, she mentions this big bang, and everyone rose, and there wasn't an immediate panic. Some of the doctors and nurses and were, well, some of the matrons and the doctors on board was trying to keep the ladies calm, the nurses calm, and making sure they got out the room in an orderly manner. And one of the people that saw this explosion, or was in the vicinity of this explosion, was Archie Jewell. And Archie was a Titanic survivor. He was one of Titanic's 6 lookouts, and he remembers the Titanic very vividly. He mentions that, seeing this big, wonderful ship sink with so many people on her. And Archie remembers the crash on the Titanic. He remembers the collision, and it woke him. And after the Titanic disaster, he got off in lifeboat number 7 on Titanic. And he remembers the cries and the screams, and he says that he used to burst out in tears after the Titanic. He just couldn't stop crying. When he boarded the Britannic and the mine struck, he said he was only a deck above from where the explosion took place. So he'd seen the water come into the ship as soon as the explosion happened. And he said that there was this like chemical in the air. It blinded them. And one man came rushing through and knocked him on the head. And he bashed him on the head, and one side of the head, he was bleeding. And he was blind in one eye from blood from the injury. From what he said he looked like old Nelson. That's what it. So he made a bit of light out of the incident, and so he got up onto the boat deck, and he said that he got into a lifeboat. Unfortunately, what the captain tried to do with the Britannic was he tried to shallow the ship. For some reason, as the explosion had knocked the steering gear out of the ship, the rudder wouldn't steer, and the explosion took hold between 2 and 3 holds, and it had caused the forward bulkheads to completely damage. There was no bulkheads really left, and a fireman's tunnel had been damaged, so she was letting in a lot of water. But on paper, she could have floated, and she'd only damaged 4 compartments from the initial explosion. So on paper, she should have floated, and she should have stayed afloat, and she would have made it to land, and probably made it back to Southampton to be repaired, or Belfast to be repaired. But during the night staff and the day staff, they were changing. So normally the bulkhead doors would be closed because of the war, but because of the staff change between the firemen and the trimmers, they had to open the doors to allow these people to get easy access to their designated areas. So these doors were wide open at the time of the explosion, and it is said that the Britannic had warped her steel, so some of the doors had been jammed. But there was 2 doors open to the sea, between boiler room number 5 and the fireman's tunnel. And Richie Kohler believes that one of the doors was forced open by a crew, and because there was 3 ways these doors could be closed: manually, or an electrical switch from the bridge that would electrically bring them down, or there was a float underneath the floor plates, that if water was coming in and there was enough water, that it would trip a catch on the doors and they would just drop down into position. But now one of the doors had clearly been stuck in the full open position because of it jammed in its falls. But one of the bulkhead doors we have no reason, or there is no real reason for why it never closed, but it stayed open. And Richie thinks that maybe one of the crew was trying to save his friends from drowning and allowed the door to stay open, and it stayed there. So he jammed it open to stop it from closing. So there was 2 doors open to the sea. So now she was flooding more compartments. But also, now in November, even though here it would be freezing cold because it's winter, but in the Aegean Sea, it's not. It's near Greece. It's pretty warm in Greece, even around November time. So what they wanted to do, as they hadn't taken on any wounded soldiers yet, they were actually outbound to pick up wounded soldiers. The doctors had ordered the nurses to open the portholes on the lower decks to ventilate the wards, because this was all before ventilation and all this snazzy stuff we have these days to keep us cool. But on Britannic, they did. In 1916, they didn't have all the snazzy stuff we have now to keep us cool. So what they had to do was they ordered the portholes open. Now this was against all war regulations, so they've broken and met so many rules by keeping these portholes open. It's unbelievable. But they opened them up to ventilate the wards for the soldiers that would be taken on at Lemnos. So these portholes, which were normally, maybe 25 feet above water level, were now being submerged because the ship had sunk so much by the head. And she probably would have stayed like that if these portholes had been closed. But these portholes were now being submerged on E-deck and allowing water to flow in them. So now compartments were now being affected that normally wouldn't have been affected. So on paper, Britannic could have stayed afloat. And if the captain had kept the ship stationary, she probably would have done, because she was designed that way. But because of these portholes and the captain trying to beach the ship, and he was moving the ship, he was dragging the ship down. Because you've got to imagine, the ship's bow is no longer facing towards the horizon anymore. She's going down. So she's only going to go in the direction she's going in. So she's now sinking very quickly. And but you see, Captain Bartlett wasn't a ship designer. Although he had an affinity love for the Britannic, he wasn't Thomas Andrews It wasn't Alexandra Carlisle. And these, unlike on Titanic, Captain Smith had the luxury of there being a designer on board the ship when it sank, when it was sinking, so they could give them an overview or so how long it would take the ship to sink and what was really happening to the ship. So they had a more realistic analysis of what was really going on. Captain Bartlett didn't. So he was guessing all the time. So he was thinking this ship can make it, but he was unaware of what was going on below decks. He was getting some reports from below what was going on, but he wasn't getting a full picture. At one moment, he did stop the ship and he was abandoning the ship. He was allowing, people off. But during the sinking, some of the crew had before the abandoned ship order, during the sinking, some crew had launched the lifeboats before the captain gave the order to abandon ship. So there was 2 lifeboats launched from the stern, and they were asked to come back to pick up swimmers from the water. They got off safely, but 2 of them didn't. And unfortunately, Archie Jaw was in one of these lifeboats that was chopped up. In fact, I have a detailed letter, which I'm going to read now, of his miraculous survival. So this is a letter he wrote to his sister after the sinking. Most of us jumped in the water, but it was no good. We was pulled right under the blades. I shut my eyes and said goodbye to this world, but I was struck with a big piece of the boat and got pushed right under the blades. And as I was going around like a top, I came up under some of the wreckage. Everything was going black to me when someone on top was struggling and pushed the wreckage away. So I came up just in time. I was nearly done for. There was one poor fellow drowning and he caught hold of me, but I had to shake him off. So the poor fellow went under. Archie was caught up in this propeller, on the port propeller, because they had to use the port propeller to push the ship towards an island called Kia, which was only a few miles off, because there was no way the Britannic was going to make it all the way to Lemnos. So he had to push it towards Kia. And you can imagine the ship's taking a lot of water on, and she's going down by the bow, starboard side bow, and she's being dragged under. And it's like having flat tires on your car. 4 flat tires. It's a huge undertaking. It's been using the engines because the rudder was no longer steering the ship. Was not the done thing, but they needed to, and she was only moving around maybe 3 degrees each time, so it wasn't much, but it was somewhat effective, and it did push the ship towards Kia in the end. And but during this time, the propellers were coming out of the water, so it became water level, and they were still turning because the captain was still, going on with the ship and trying to beach it. And these lifeboats were chopped up, and Violet Jessop was also in one of these lifeboats as well, in lifeboat number 4. So that was his miraculous survival. And as he was pushing the ship towards Kia, the Britannic overshot Kia in the end. So he tried pushing the ship towards Kia again because it overshot the island. But by this time, Britannic was doomed to sink, and she was not going to make it. Whatever the case, the best bet was for them to reach some shallow water, but it wasn't the case for Britannic. She was just moving so slowly that it was just a bad situation through and through. But before he gave the abandoned ship order, he did around about half 8 in the morning, 8:30 in the morning. He did order the ship to be abandoned, and they were launched the lifeboats. But what he realized that while the ship was stationary, that the ship had slowed down, the sinking had slowed down. So he decided to take one last shot at reaching Kia. And unfortunately, during this time, Britannic was now, even the forecastle deck, which was the foremost part of the ship, was now taking on water. It was submerging. So at this point, the Britannic hasn't got long. Captain Bartlett had such a love for the ship. I don't think he really could admit that his ship was doomed. But I suppose he was just trying to be a good captain, trying to save the lives on board. So anyway, in the end, the Britannic had taken on so much water, and she was now going very quickly, that he gave the order to abandon ship. He gave around maybe 4 blasts of the whistle to alert the engine room staff, the crew in the engine room, to get out, to abandon ship. Captain Bartlett was still in his pajamas at this point, because earlier that morning he'd been taking a bath, ready to take his duties on the bridge. But when the explosion took place, he never got dressed, so he was still in his pajamas. And Violet Jessop says that he was pulled out of the water by Colonel Anderson in one of the port launches, motor launches, in his pajamas. And she found this quite funny. She found this quite hilarious, that her captain would be pulled out of the water in his pajamas. Captain Bartlett was still on the bridge with a few other crew members, and they just, as the ship sank, he just walked into the water. He didn't jump. He just swam off. That's how low the ship was at this point. It was now coming onto the bridge. So he just walked into the water from the starboard wing and swam into the water with the rest of the crew. Some of the engine crew had not even abandoned the ship yet, and they were running, and they managed to jump from the sea deck promenade and jumped into the water and pulled out of the water. One of the quartermasters earlier on in the sinking had gone down to the pantries to fill the lifeboats up with bread and food in case that they were stranded. And by the time he'd come up from the pantry, the ship was rolling into the water, and he had to drop the bread and jump in. So he survived as well. So the Britannic finally sank just a mile off the island of Kea, around 55 minutes later, after the explosion from the mine. The mine had been laid by a U-boat called U-73, and it'd been laid about 3 weeks prior to Britannic being in those waters. In fact, another ship called the Berdigala, a French ship, had also been sunk by the same minefield that the Britannic struck, and she now lies in 2 pieces a mile away from where the Britannic is now lying. But the problem is, the Germans were laying these mines in the Aegean Sea, but you see, the British weren't aware that the Germans had the technology to lay mines in such deep waters. But they did, and they were not going to tell the British that. They were going to keep that hush-hush. And another ship called the Russell had also struck a mine laid by U-73. Not the same minefield, but it was another minefield that she'd laid. And also the Berdigala had sunk only a week before the Britannic. Now, if the British had realised that mines were sinking their ships in the Aegean, in the Zia Channel, well, they would have marked those waters as unsafe, and Britannic probably would have been spared, and she wouldn't have sunk if the British had realised that the Germans had the technology to lay these mines in such deep water, and would have saved Britannic from sinking. So there's so many ways Britannic could have been saved, and then gone on to be a passenger ship, which she was intended to be. But fate wasn't on her side, and Britannic ended up on the Aegean Sea floor, and that's where she still lies to this day.
That's really interesting, though, about Germans leaving the mines with the U-boats. I never knew that this thing could exist, really. So that was mind-blowing.
Exactly. Neither did the British. Like, as I said, the British didn't know that the Germans were doing this. And again, the Germans were not going to tell the British. It's not going to. But you see, people make the mistake. Well, why did a mine hit the Britannic? Well, you see, they don't say, okay, it's a hospital ship, let's not sink it. If it's going to come across, you see, the mines were laid there, particularly for naval traffic. It was there to sink naval traffic. It wasn't there to sink a hospital ship. Because you see, there'd been an agreement on both sides of the war that any ship they're under the protective status of a hospital ship, a civilian hospital ship, and both sides of the war were using the same colours, and that they would not attack the hospital ship. So Britannic was sunk practically by accident. She was in the wrong place at the wrong time, just like her sister Titanic. And it's like I said, fate was really not on Britannic's side, because there were so many misses that could have saved her. If the Aquitania had gone out instead of the Britannic, we'd have been talking about the Aquitania, because more than likely the Aquitania would have come across the mine and sank the Aquitania. So, but unfortunately, it was Britannic that would be the one that would be sunk, with the loss of 30 people on board. One person that died on the Britannic at the time was a 15-year-old boy. He was only 15, and he was, I think he was a kitchen scullion. So he was killed. I've read a few things about him and his mother and father. They were heartbroken when they found. I mean, I suppose on a hospital ship you'd think that your son was safe, but no. So yeah, they lost their little boy, and they were heartbroken. Britannic has an emotional side to her too. I think any ship that has cost the lives of people should always be remembered, and Britannic is one of them. So yeah, that's Britannic, and it's sad.
It
So
is really sad, actually. I feel like I'm gonna want to cry almost, because it's just it's just
yeah,
really heartbreaking to hear so many stories, really. And like you said before, Jake, the sinking happened at the wrong place at the wrong time, and
yeah,
people would just think it might be a shock. But with this new information coming to light, it makes more sense how it was more accidental compared to things that were
yeah.
planned and all of that.
Well, hospital ships, I wouldn't say that. I mean, hospitals were becoming controversial anyway, particularly with the Germans. I mean, Britannic was becoming a controversial thing, because they thought that the British were using hospital ships to carry munitions. So, but yeah, it was an accident for Britannic. It wasn't done on purpose. And again, it's just that I think with the Titanic and Britannic, they had this thing of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I think with Titanic, she was sank by nature. Britannic was sunk by human error, as well as, accidental. Because, like I said, on paper, Britannic should have survived and would have survived, and she probably would have made it to Kia, or even to Madras, if these doors had been closed and if the portals had been closed.
And of course, the Britannic has been left on the seabed for an awful long time, but I recently found out that her wreck was discovered before Titanic, about like 5 to 10 years before the Titanic was discovered.
Yeah,
And it was like, and I can't remember who discovered it, but I had a feeling it was Simon Mills.
it wasn't actually, no. Simon Mills had really nothing to do with Britannic until the mid-90s. It was actually a Jacques Cousteau, who was pretty famous during the 70s and 60s for deep sea diving, and he was what they call the father of scuba diving. He was happier underneath the sea than he was on land. You would have, I suppose, you would have seen him as more of a fish than a human, because he loved going swimming, and he used to love taking his kids swimming. And Jacques Cousteau was getting on in age. He was in his 70s when he discovered Britannic. He was hired out by the Titanic International Society, the Historical Society. Originally, Cousteau was only in the region of where Britannic went down, because he was looking. His original mission was to search for the mythical city of Atlantis. That's what his original mission was, and he was contacted by the Titanic Society to go out and search, because they'd heard that he was in the area, and they had contacted him and hired him out to go and search for Britannic. You see, Cousteau wasn't really interested in Britannic, not originally. His goal was to find the city of Atlantis. They used the original Admiralty reports of where the ship was sunk. They gave them the wrong position. They hadn't, so they were side scanning the ocean and they couldn't find anything. So they went a bit closer to Kiev, and they used their side scan sonar, and they found this big object coming into view, and they knew something that was on the sea floor. You know, it picked something up. So they had found the Britannic. That was it. They'd found her. So after 60 years of her, well, just under 60 years of her sinking, she's been found. They did their first dive, I believe, in 1976. Jacques Cousteau went down to the wreck. In fact, think about it, this was in the mid-70s. Britannic is in 400 feet of water, and she's just pushing the limits of human capability of survival underneath these depths. So Cousteau had to come up with a new way of diving to get to this mythical, the ship, this historical, this wreck, and so he had to come up with all different ways of mixing gases and things like that. So realistically, because of him, he's made what scuba diving is today, because he was just the master. He was the one that came up with these ways, and whoever's into scuba diving these days needs him to thank, because he was him that he is the father. He is. So he did a documentary. So during his discovery of the Britannic, he did a documentary called Searching for the Britannic, and he invited survivors to talk with him around the table, including Captain Bartlett's daughter was involved in these discussions. She was there, yes. She was there talking to Jacques Cousteau about the Britannic. So Ellen Bartlett was there. And he went round and asked the survivors what they thought the Britannic had struck. They all said, apart from one, said it was a torpedo. But then there was one that said no. Categorically, he said it's a mine. He knew it was a mine. Anyway, but one of the survivors was a lady called Sheila Macbeth Mitchell, who would be invited. Now, she was 86 at the time, so she was getting on in age, just like Cousteau. And she was getting on in age, and but she was even though she was 86, you would have mistaken her for a 20-year-old soul. She had such a young soul, and she was so smart and bright and sharp. Anyway, she was invited to the Calypso, which was the research vessel of Jacques Cousteau, who found the Britannic. So she was flown by helicopter all the way to the Aegean Ocean, to the Zia Strait, to join Cousteau on his dive to Britannic. And she was there, and she just brought life to the ship. The people just loved her on the ship. So anyway, she was there talking about her survival and what happened on the Britannic, and she just loved being there. Then she was invited by Cousteau to dive the wreck in a submarine, and she did. She agreed, and she went down to the Britannic, and she said she wasn't really bothered about the wreck. She was more bothered about the sea life, because she said that she said that the wreck was a dead thing, but she remarked about the captain's bathroom that the tiles on the floor were so glossy and clean. It was as if they'd been cleaned just yesterday. She was just a remarkable lady, and after she came back up, she asked Cousteau. She says, next time you go down, could you? She had a clock with her, that I think it was just a souvenir or something. She asked him if he could go down to her cabin and get this clock, but he couldn't, because Britannic is a dangerous place. People make mistakes. Any wreck is dangerous, but Britannic in particular, she is dangerous. She is a beautiful thing, but you have to respect the conditions she's in. She's in the shipping lanes as well. So, and the currents are constantly, changing. So it's not for the faint-hearted. You do not dive this wreck unless you are fully experienced and you know what you are letting yourself in for, because people have died since Britannic sank. People have died on this wreck, and also Britannic is protected. She's a protected wreck under the Greek government. Under the Greece government, sorry, that you have to have permits to dive this wreck. You are not allowed to remove anything from the wreck. It is a federal offence to remove anything from that wreck unless under permission by the Greece government. Britannic was 882 foot long. She sank in 400 feet of water. So the bow struck the seabed before the stern even settled below the surface. But to get that bow down, she suffered so much structural damage during the descent and the strike, the bow strike in the sea floor, that the bow just tore off. And it's kind of attached, but it's only attached by a few, probably by a piece of string. It's not great. It is torn off, and but the rest of the ship, she's in spectacular condition. There's hardly any deterioration at all from the day she sank. As Richie said, in some places she's a ship, in other places she's a wreck. But she's so magnificent. But it isn't easy, and you have to have many years of experience of scuba diving before you even consider diving Britannic. It isn't for the faint-hearted, but it is. I think if you're a scuba diver, if you are training to be a scuba diver, Britannic is your goal. That is the place you want to be. That is the place you want to go. And if you've done it, then well done.
This is like the thing, because if I ever travel, because I'm not going to be trained as a submarine diver, but if I was a guest one day, I think Britannic, Titanic, probably Lusitania would be my visiting goals, but I could never see myself
definitely.
doing like that. But I have to remind myself, never say never.
But again, even the Lusitania, yes, it looks reachable. She's only 300 foot down, but again, that's still pushing limits, and you still have to have many years of experience to be able to scuba dive this wreck, because you have got pressure, you have got all the oxygen and everything going on. It is deadly if you come up too quickly. You have to come up in stages. You can't. It takes a long time. I think Richie said you only get so many. I think you probably get 10, maybe 15 minutes on the wreck, and the rest is ascending and descending. It is a long process, because otherwise, if you come up too quickly, your blood will turn into slush and you will die. You get the bends. And I think from what I've heard is that it's if you know when you get the bends, because it's like being drunk, because you get, that's what it's like. But it's not a nice thing to have, but I think a lot of divers have said that Britannic is the untouched Titanic because of the protection over the wreck. I mean, now you're not even allowed to dive inside the wreck unless you have permission to dive inside the wreck. A lot of people have said, well, why didn't they bring the Britannic up? Well, she's in better condition than Titanic. Well, she's been down underneath the sea for a century, and if you did bring her up, I mean, if people would be stupid enough to even consider paying all that money to raise the wreck, if the Greece government gives you permission, and you'd have to go through the Greece government first, which I doubt that would even be considered. If you did go through all that and you did raise the wreck, what would you do with it? Because in the end, you're going to have to try and preserve it. She's an 882-foot long ship. The best thing for us to do is leave them where they are and for us to study them, for those people who can study them. And then and we can study them too, even from the surface, because we can study them from afar, because we can do it on our TV screens when they do documentaries. We can do it, leave them where they are, because they are a monument, and in many cases probably the only monument to these people that have died.
Yeah.
Let's leave them where they are and we can study them, because you know, a lot of people said, you know, if we didn't have Britannic, we wouldn't know half the stuff that we do know. Sorry, that we do know on Titanic, and vice versa with Britannic. And you know, you can't have Britannic without Titanic. Can't have Titanic without Britannic, because they've helped us understand the past, and they are constantly helping us understand the past. And leave them where they are. They're fine where they are. You know, it's not rocket science, but I think I totally agree with bringing artifacts up within reason from Britannic. I know I would like to see a few artifacts from Britannic in museums, because that would help cement Britannic's legacy. Because in the end, just like Titanic, I mean, Britannic will be here even after Titanic is gone, but in the end, Britannic will collapse and she'll be gone too. So it's up to us now to preserve that history, and for us to be able to cement Britannic's legacy for future generations. And that means let's bring some Britannic you know, artifacts up and put them in museums for people to be able to enjoy and see, instead of them being on the ocean where they're not able to be seen by the majority, only by the few. And I think that's what the future holds for Britannic. I think that's how she should be held. Let's not do what we do with Titanic, where we literally take everything off Titanic. We only take a few things from Britannic and leave the rest to the sea, where we can study. Yeah, I think that's what should happen for Britannic. I know recently there's been a recent dive to Britannic, where they've allowed the divers to go inside and study the ship. I mean, I know they've been in a few areas. I'm not going to say too much because I'm sure Richie would shoot me. But they have been inside the wreck, and hopefully soon some new data, some new footage, some new information will be coming to light from Britannic. And I know there's been one thing from what Richie told me. I know Richie would shoot me but Richie said to me, there's one thing on Britannic that hasn't been filmed on Titanic, and they've been able to film it. So I don't know what that is, but I'll leave that to your imaginations of what it could be. Get that excitement.
I definitely think it sounds like a clue, and I definitely got 3 things in my head really, but I'm sure really Richie won't like it, and I won't say it out of respect.
That's all I'm leaving for you, is they have filmed the Britannic inside. The Greece government did allow it was no limit. I mean, everything was off, like you can go inside wherever, doesn't matter where it's all off limits, so you can go in. So they were able to go inside. But I know Richie said there was one thing that was filmed inside Britannic or on Britannic that hasn't been filmed on Titanic. So again, I'll leave that to the imaginations, because even I don't know. So yeah, let's
well, let's just make it peace on that. Let the peace be said.
There we go.
Oh my goodness. But then we've got to wrap this up here, because we've got to add a final question, because I know that this is the longest interview we've ever done, which is great, because we had a lot to say about Britannic. But I always wanted to know, how do you think the Britannic should be preserved in the future, Jake? Because I did ask a similar thing, a
Mhm.
question to Richie when we did the interview, and I said to him, how do you think the Britannic should be remembered as well as Titanic? And he definitely had a lot to say on this, really, but since it was in the
Yeah,
last year, I cannot remember what what he actually said.
I mean, I think everyone has their own personal views on how Britannic should be remembered. I mean, Britannic sadly has been forgotten in the past, say, I would say half a century of her being on the seafloor. It's only probably since the Britannic has been discovered that more interest has developed within Britannic, or the attention has Britannic's got some attention, and there's been a game about her recently called Patroness of the Mediterranean, where you're able to experience the ship as it was, and it's a museum, virtual museum thing where you can experience the sinking, experience so much on that game. It's unbelievable. It's such an amazing game. It was just so well done. Well done to the guys at THG, Titanic Honor and Glory, that did it. So big thumbs up to them. The way I think she needs to be remembered as much as Titanic. I do believe there needs to be maybe a film or maybe a series or a drama done about the ship, because there was one done, a TV movie which I spit every time I mention it, because it was done back in 2000. It was just done so dreadfully. It was, yeah, it was. It's not even worth mentioning. It's bad. But I think it needs to be done. Someone needs to do it properly, and I think there needs to be something like that to again put because I mean, I think Britannic is more well known within the Titanic community than outside the community. I think she needs to be a little bit more known in the wider audiences too, to know that there was Britannic, there was another ship, and she did sink just like Titanic. And I think the wreck needs to, and it's like I've said before, just now, is the wreck needs to be left where it is, and it's like I've said, it needs to be, and that's how she should be. That's how she should be, and that's where she should stay. We don't want none of these notions that we can easily raise it, and that you can't. There's no way. It's not going to happen. The Greece government won't allow it. It's so protected, they won't allow it. It will be a federal. It'd be a federal thing to do. You would be arrested. You will be thrown in prison for it. You can't raise it. You can only dive it if you are skilled enough to dive the wreck. But I think we can study it as well as from through the eyes of those divers that have been through to her. We can study her, we can enjoy her, and we can learn from her. And I think realistically she should be I know there was some plans to turn her into a underwater museum, and I think that's a great idea. I think that's a great idea, is to present Britannic as an underwater museum, as an archaeology, an underwater archaeology. I can never pronounce it. Archaeology, thing, object, and remember that 30 lives did lose it. That was lost that night, that day. And they shouldn't have been lost. And this is the tragic part of Britannic, is they shouldn't have been lost. There was no need for any lives to be lost. But 30 lives were lost, and we need to remember that. It doesn't matter how, and people will say, yeah, but only 30 lives were lost when 1,400 people went down with the tide. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Lives were lost, and that's it. Doesn't matter. It's not a competition. Britannic did kill people, and we need to remember those who were lost. And realistically, Britannic shouldn't be on the bottom of the sea, and it should have been saved. And there were so many near misses where she could have been saved, but she didn't, and she did end up on the 18th floor. But the future for Britannic is remember her for what she is, and to study her, and to study what we can on her before the sea takes her, with like the Titanic. But I think if artifacts are going to be removed with it, and they have to be removed within reason. I know Richie said in a documentary that they were thinking about removing some of the anchors, and I'm thinking that might be a little bit too much. But yeah, I think maybe a few beds that were on her, or a few plates or something, or
Yeah. No, it's kind of like having
anchors.
an anchor. Oh,
New.
sorry. It sounds like it sounds like it's having an anchor removed from the Britannic is like removing and raising up the Marconi wireless apparatus from the Titanic. This is how I see it in my mind
I
because
think so too, but I think the apparatus on the Titanic, well, it might be a lot easier than removing anchors from Britannic, because they're literally attached to the wreck. I mean, they are attached. They're still attached, and I think if they can't raise the apparatus on the Titanic, try and do the Britannic apparatus, because Britannic had the same apparatus. From what we know, it still had the same apparatus that was on Titanic. Okay, it's not the same as having Titanics, but it's near as, and rescue that if we can, and I'm all for that. But again, it's like I said, it has to be done within reason. It can't just be, okay, we can remove anchors and we can remove this and anything that's going to cause any real disturbance to the wreck itself. I mean, she's an old lady, just like Titanic. She's been down there a long time. She's brittle. Even though she's in better condition than Titanic, she's still a wreck. She's an old lady. She deserves the respect of that, and study what we can on that old lady and enjoy her and study her and for us to be able to study her from a distance, like I've done all these years. So yeah, that's what I think on Britannic. But there's a lot. It is a lot there. But there you go.
well, there's definitely a lot there, but the Britannic is such a wonderful ship, really, and I definitely I have learnt to appreciate her as well as Titanic a bit more because
Yeah,
I wasn't really interested in her, but since I actually did like the History Channel and my Titanic interview, and of course doing the interviews with Richie as well, not interview for the Titanic documentary,
yeah,
I just came to appreciate Britannic more than ever, and
yeah.
I think she's becoming my favourite now, overtaking Titanic.
Yeah, I think it was the same for me. I mean, Titanic was my first interest, and then it was Britannic, and then Britannic, and I think I fell in love with Britannic from Titanic, just like Richie fell in love with Britannic from Titanic. Britannic is, I mean, where Titanic, it's broken up. It's in a dark place, and Britannic is alive. There's light. There's a lot of light down there. It's alive. It's we need, and that's I think that's Britannic. And I think people think, is it okay to love Britannic because of Titanic? Yeah, of course it is. It's absolutely fine. In fact, it's okay because I always think you can't love Titanic without Britannic, and it's the other way around, because they are the same ship. I mean, without Britannic had all the bells and whistles added to her, but without those bells and whistles, she's Titanic. She is Titanic, and that's it's okay to love her. It's okay to study her. It's okay to love Titanic as well as Britannic. There's nothing wrong with that. Just because you love Titanic and you go and love Britannic doesn't take away that you love Titanic any less. In fact, you should love it more, because you are expanding your interest outside that box. You are going beyond the Titanic story and learning about her sister, who also met a tragic fate only 4 years later. So there you go. I love Britannic, and I think that's why people call me Mr. Britannic, because I do have an affinity love for this ship. It will go with me That's it. That's me. Britannic.
And there's nothing wrong with that as well, because you are very passionate in history, and there's always going to be like an event or an object or a person that's going to stick with you for the rest of your life. And I
Yeah,
think with you and Britannic, Jake, that's one of those great examples.
absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, she'll always be with me. Yeah, always. She's the old and faithful, as you say.
I hear that she's gonna steal Olympics title of Old Reliable and Old Faithful now. So
She is.
Titanic's switched to her
Yes, I
place.
think she's the old faithful. Yes.
Oh,
So,
dear.
but
Oh, dear. Oh.
yeah,
But it was an absolute pleasure to talk about Britannic again, and I know that even though that we did a great interview, and of course we've got to remember those who have lost their lives on the anniversary, which is today, and then also we've got to remember the people who have survived as well. So all in their minds, we'll be keeping them in our thoughts and our minds and our hearts today.
absolutely.
So and then we're just sending our love really, and I think that sounds a bit
Thank you.
awkward, but it's just
It is, but it's okay. It's fine. It's okay to love Britannic. So there
yeah.
you go.
Oh, absolutely. And we'll definitely round it up here because even though Britannic is very special, she will never be forgotten. And Jake, thank you so much for coming on again.
Thank you.
And it's so hard really now to try and get processed because I think I'm getting like a little bit emotional after this now because it's just like it's special, but she's
It's
always
more
been
emotional than people
special.
give credit. Yeah, she is.
Definitely, we're going to have to try another time. We definitely got to have to talk about Archie Jewell and Captain Bartlett as well, because
Yes,
I know
definitely.
that you really want to do these two, Jake. So probably,
Absolutely.
yeah, yeah, definitely for next year or Christmas,
Thank
definitely
you.
do that.
Yeah,
Fingers crossed.
absolutely. Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you for having me. It's been great. Thank you.
and honestly, Jake, it's always a pleasure for you to come on, really. And I know that you're going to come up as a regular guest at that point, really. But it's
I
always great
probably.
to have you on. Oh, but it was really great to have you, Jake, as always. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And thank you so much to everyone who's been watching. And yeah, until then, I don't think I got any more words to say on this really because it's
No.
just like trying to sink it in. But so we'll leave it there. And until then, we'll see you very soon. Take care.
Thank
Bye.
you. Take care. Bye.
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 If you enjoyed this week's episode, please subscribe for more historical content. Until next time, this has been History Inside a Nutshell, Departing from the Docks. Thank you so much for all of your support and enjoy the rest of your voyage.